Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we journey into the heart of fire itself to tell the tale of Ragnaros the Firelord, one of the most ancient and destructive beings ever to exist in the Warcraft universe. His story spans from the very dawn of creation, when the world was nothing but chaos and flame, through ages of imprisonment and servitude, to his catastrophic return and ultimate demise. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this tale of primordial fury unfold before you. Before we begin, take a moment to prepare yourself for the journey ahead. Find a comfortable position, whether lying in bed or settled into a favorite chair. Let your breathing slow and deepen. The story you are about to hear is one of fire and fury, of ancient powers and mortal courage, but it is also a story told in the gentle tones of a peaceful night. Let the words wash over you like waves of warmth, carrying you into relaxation even as they paint pictures of elemental conflict in your mind's eye. The tale of Ragnaros is one of the most epic in all of Warcraft lore, spanning millennia and touching upon some of the most fundamental aspects of how the world came to be. It is a story that involves titans and old gods, dwarven kings and mortal heroes, world trees and volcanic mountains. It is a story of imprisonment and freedom, of servitude and dominion, of hubris and ultimate downfall. And it begins in a time so distant that the very concept of time itself had not yet taken form. Long before the kingdoms of humanity rose from the wilderness, long before the elves built their shining cities, or the dwarves carved their mountain halls, long before life as we know it existed at all, there was only elemental chaos. In those primordial times, the world that would become Azeroth was a place of constant turmoil, a roiling sphere of conflicting energies where the fundamental forces of creation warred endlessly against one another. At the heart of this nascent world, something magnificent was taking shape. A titan, one of the godlike beings who shaped the cosmos itself, was slowly maturing within the planet's core. This world soul, as such entities are called, was consuming vast quantities of the fifth element known as spirit, the binding force that creates harmony between all other elements. Without spirit to maintain balance, the other elemental forces were thrown into utter chaos. From this chaos emerged the elemental lords, beings of incredible power who embodied the four primary elements of creation. These were not gods in the traditional sense, not beings who had been created with purpose or design. They were something more fundamental, more primal, entities that had spontaneously manifested from the pure elemental energies that composed the young world. There was Thunderaan the Stone Mother, Queen of Earth, and all that lies beneath the surface. She was ancient beyond reckoning, patient as the stones she ruled, enduring as the mountains that would one day bear her name. Her domain encompassed every pebble and boulder, every vein of ore, every cavern that delved deep into the world's foundations. There was Neptulon the Tide Hunter, master of the depths and all waters that flow across the world. He ruled the primordial oceans with absolute authority, commanding currents and tides, storms and calm alike. Where his influence spread, life would eventually flourish, for water is the source of all living things. There was Alakir, the Wind Lord, sovereign of the skies and every breeze that blows. Capricious and unpredictable, he embodied the dual nature of air itself, sometimes gentle and refreshing, other times violent and destructive. His winds could carry the seeds of life across vast distances, or strip flesh from bone with their fury. And there was Ragnaros, the Firelord, lord of flame and fury, master of all that burns and consumes. Of the four elemental lords, he was perhaps the most singular in his nature. Where the others had aspects of nurturing within their destructive potential, Ragnaros was pure devastation. He was the hunger of flame given consciousness, the rage of wildfire given form. Of all the elemental lords, Ragnaros was perhaps the most terrible. Where Therazane was patient and enduring, content to let ages pass while her mountains grew grain by grain, Ragnaros demanded immediate satisfaction. Where Neptulon was cunning and adaptable, his waters finding the path of least resistance, even as they wore away the hardest stone, Ragnaros simply overwhelmed whatever stood before him. Where Alakir was swift and capricious, his moods changing like the winds he commanded, Ragnaros burned with a consistent fury that never wavered. He embodied not just the warmth and light of fire, but its hunger, its rage, its absolute desire to consume everything it touches until nothing remains but ash and ember. There was no mercy in Ragnaros, no compassion, no understanding of anything beyond the imperative to burn. He existed to consume, and he would consume until nothing remained. The Firelord's form was itself a testament to his nature. He manifested as a towering figure of living flame, a humanoid torso emerging from an endless pool of magma. His eyes burned with the intensity of newly born stars, and when he spoke, his voice was the roar of 1,000 volcanoes erupting simultaneously. Simply being in his presence could be fatal to lesser beings, the heat radiating from his form enough to ignite anything combustible within considerable distance. Ragnaros ruled over innumerable lesser fire elementals, creatures of living flame that served his will without question. These beings ranged from tiny sprites of dancing fire to massive conflagrations that could consume entire forests. They were extensions of his power, manifestations of his endless hunger, and they worshipped him with the absolute devotion that only elementals can know. His domain was one of constant conflagration, realm of molten rock and rivers of fire, where temperatures soared beyond anything that mortal minds could comprehend. The very air shimmered with heat, and the ground was never truly solid, always threatening to liquefy beneath whatever dared to tread upon it. Rivers of magma flowed in channels that shifted and changed according to the Firelord's whims, and pools of liquid fire erupted without warning into geysers of superheated destruction. At the heart of this infernal domain, Ragnaros sat upon a throne of solidified obsidian in the center of a vast lake of magma. This seat of power was the hottest point in all his territory, a place where even the mightiest fire elementals approached with caution. From there, he directed his endless wars against the other elemental lords, plotting campaigns of conquest that had been waged since before the concept of time had meaning. The Firelord employed brute force to destroy his enemies, caring nothing for subtlety or strategy. His approach was simple and devastating: burn everything, consume everything, leave nothing but scorched earth in his wake. Wherever Ragnaros went, volcanoes erupted without warning, spewing forth rivers of molten rock that carved paths of destruction across the primordial landscape. The skies choked with ember and ash, blocking out what little light existed in those chaotic times. His assaults were brazen and overwhelming, striking at his fellow elemental lords with a ferocity that earned their eternal hatred. The other three came to despise Ragnaros above all else, viewing him not as a rival to be respected, but as a threat to be eliminated. Yet for all their enmity, they could never truly defeat him, for the Firelord's power seemed without limit. He drew strength from every flame that burned, every volcano that rumbled, every spark of heat that existed in the world. The elemental wars raged for countless millennia, shaping the very landscape of the young world. Mountains rose and fell, oceans boiled and froze, continents shifted and broke apart as the four elemental lords clashed again and again. There was no victor in these endless conflicts, no resolution to the eternal struggle. The elements simply could not exist in harmony without spirit to bind them together, and so they warred on, heedless of the destruction they wrought. Then came the old gods. These malevolent entities descended upon Azeroth from the great dark beyond, cosmic horrors whose very existence defied mortal comprehension. They were not creatures of flesh and blood in any conventional sense, but rather manifestations of the void itself, beings of pure corruption whose touch twisted everything it contacted. They came seeking the nascent titan sleeping within the world's core, hoping to corrupt it and turn its power to their own dark purposes. The old gods established their empire upon the surface of Azeroth, creating vast citadels of black stone from which they spread their influence across the land. They spawned armies of twisted servants, creatures born from nightmare and madness that served their master's unfathomable will. The Black Empire, as it would come to be known, cast its shadow over the entire world. For the first time in Azeroth's history, the elemental lords faced a common enemy. These invaders from beyond the stars threatened not just their individual domains, but the very existence of the world they fought over. The old gods cared nothing for fire or water, earth or air. They sought only corruption, only the spread of their dark influence, only the ultimate victory of the void over all creation. And so, miraculously, the elemental lords set aside their eternal feuds and united against the cosmic threat. Ragnaros fought alongside Neptulon, Therazane, and Alakir. Their combined might turned against the servants of the old gods. It was an alliance born of necessity rather than trust, a temporary truce between beings who had known nothing but conflict for eons. But even united, the elemental lords could not match the power of the old gods. These entities were not merely powerful, they were primordial forces in their own right, beings whose existence predated the formation of the world itself. They wielded magics that the elementals could not comprehend, powers drawn from the infinite darkness of the void. One by one, the elemental lords fell, not destroyed, for beings of such fundamental nature cannot truly be killed, but defeated and enslaved, their wills broken and bound to the service of their new masters. Ragnaros, for all his fury, for all his terrible power, found himself chained to the will of the old gods, forced to serve as a general in their armies of corruption. It was perhaps the greatest humiliation the Firelord had ever known. He, who had ruled the flames since the dawn of time, who had bowed to nothing and no one, was now a servant. His rage burned hotter than ever, but it was impotent rage, fury without outlet, hatred without means of expression. The chains that bound him were not physical, but something far more insidious, tentacles of shadow that wrapped around his consciousness and bent his will to the purposes of his masters. The old gods used him as a weapon against any who would oppose their empire, and Ragnaros had no choice but to obey. When they commanded him to burn, he burned. When they ordered him to destroy, he destroyed. His flames, which had once been expressions of his own terrible will, were now tools in the hands of entities he despised more than anything else in existence. The other elemental lords suffered similar fates. Thunderaan was forced to reshape the earth according to the old gods' designs, carving out foundations for their twisted citadels. Neptulon was compelled to flood regions that might have harbored resistance, drowning any who might have opposed the Black Empire. Alakir became a messenger of doom, his winds carrying the corruption of the old gods to the farthest corners of the world. In their shared servitude, the elemental lords found a bitter irony. They who had warred against each other since before time had meaning were now united in chains, their ancient conflicts rendered meaningless by their common subjugation. Some whispered that this was the old gods' ultimate victory over them, not just the conquest of their bodies, but the destruction of their eternal feuds, the reduction of their grand conflicts to nothing more than petty squabbles that their masters could end with a thought. For ages beyond counting, the elemental lords served their new masters. The Black Empire grew to encompass the entire world, its dark influence spreading like a cancer across the face of Azeroth. The old gods experimented with life itself, creating monstrous servants and corrupting whatever natural creatures had begun to evolve on the world's surface. It seemed as though nothing could stop their inexorable conquest, and the elemental lords could only watch and serve as the world they had once fought over was reshaped into something unrecognizable. Then the Titans arrived. The coming of the Pantheon was like the dawn of a new age, the arrival of beings so powerful that even the old gods paused in their corruption to take notice. These were the Titans, godlike entities of unimaginable might who traveled the cosmos, ordering worlds and nurturing nascent Titan spirits. They were the shapers of reality, the architects of order, beings who had existed since the universe was young and who would continue to exist long after the stars themselves had burned out. The Pantheon discovered Azeroth and immediately recognized both the world soul within and the corruption that threatened it. This nascent Titan, still slumbering in the planet's core, was perhaps the most powerful world soul they had ever encountered. Its potential was staggering, its future importance to the cosmos beyond calculation, and it was being slowly consumed by the corruption of the void. The old gods had to be stopped, or the nascent Titan would be lost to the void forever. The Titans could not fight this battle themselves, for their direct intervention risked destroying the very world soul they sought to save. Instead, they created the Titan-forged powerful servants imbued with aspects of their creator's might. These beings would serve as the Titan's hands and eyes on Azeroth, waging war against the old gods and their servants. Among the mightiest of the Titan-forged were the Keepers, beings of tremendous power who led the campaign against the Black Empire. Tyr, the paragon of justice and order, was foremost among them in the fight against the elementals. Odin, the prime designate and ruler of the Halls of Valor, fought alongside him. Together, these two keepers led the assault against Ragnaros himself. The battle against the Firelord was one of the most devastating conflicts of the entire war. Ragnaros, even weakened by His enslavement to the old gods was still a being of apocalyptic power. He called down firestorms that melted stone and boiled away rivers. He raised volcanoes from flat ground with a thought and sent waves of magma crashing against the Titan-forged armies. His flames consumed countless warriors who dared to stand against him, but the Keepers were not so easily defeated. Tyr, wielding his mighty hammer, pierced through the clouds of smoke and ash that surrounded the Firelord, scoring a blow that staggered the elemental lord. Odin flanked the momentarily vulnerable Ragnaros, and together the two Keepers overwhelmed their foe. The battle raged for days, perhaps weeks, but in the end, the outcome was inevitable. Ragnaros was defeated. With the elemental lords subdued, the Titan-forged turned their attention to the old gods themselves. These battles were even more catastrophic than those against their servants, and the Keepers learned a terrible truth. The old gods had so thoroughly embedded themselves into the world that destroying them would mean destroying Azeroth itself. The parasites had become inseparable from their host. Unable to kill the old gods, the Titan-forged instead imprisoned them beneath the surface of the world, bound by powerful wards and sealed away in eternal slumber. But what of the elemental lords? They could not be allowed to roam free, for their chaotic nature would continue to devastate the world. Yet they were not creatures of the void, not inherently evil in the way the old gods were. They were simply forces of nature, unbound by spirit, and therefore unable to exist in harmony. The solution was the elemental plane, a separate dimension created specifically to house the elementals. This was perhaps the greatest feat of magical engineering ever accomplished, the creation of an entire parallel dimension designed to contain beings of nearly limitless power. The Titan-forged carved 4 distinct domains within this plane, one for each element, each designed to be both a prison and a home for its occupant. Thunderaan was banished to Deepholm, a realm of earth and stone, where massive caverns stretched beyond sight and the weight of mountains pressed down from every direction. Here, she could shape the stone as she wished, build her kingdom according to her own designs, but she could never leave. The boundaries of Deepholm were absolute. Neptulon was sent to the abyssal maw, an endless ocean of crushing depths where no light penetrated and the pressure would have destroyed any mortal vessel instantly. The Tidehunter found this realm to his liking, for water was his element, and an infinite ocean was paradise compared to the devastation of the wars he had lost. Alakir was imprisoned in the Skywall, a realm of eternal storms and howling winds where solid ground was rare and the air itself was a weapon. The Windlord raged against his confinement at first, but eventually he too found ways to make the Skywall his kingdom, even if it remained his cage. And Ragnaros was cast into the Firelands, a dimension of eternal flame and molten rock that defied conventional description. The realm was vast beyond measure, a seemingly infinite expanse of fire and heat, where the very concept of solid matter was negotiable. Lakes of magma stretched to horizons that burned with the same intensity as the ground, and the sky was not sky at all, but simply more flame, an endless canopy of fire that provided neither day nor night, only eternal conflagration. The Firelands were designed to be a prison, but to Ragnaros, they might as well have been a kingdom. Here, at least, he was free from the servitude that had bound him to the old gods. Here, no master commanded his will, no chains bound his power. Here he could rule unchallenged over his fire elementals, building his seat of power as he saw fit, answering to no one and nothing. Sulfuron Keep rose from a vast lake of fire at the center of his domain, a fortress of black stone that somehow remained solid despite the temperatures that surrounded it. The keep was massive, its towers reaching toward the burning sky, its walls thick enough to withstand the fury of any elemental assault. Within its depths, Ragnaros constructed his throne room, a chamber of such intense heat that even the most powerful fire elementals could only enter with his permission. The fortress was not merely a seat of power, but a statement of defiance. Every stone, every wall, every tower was a declaration that Ragnaros would not be diminished by his exile. He was still the Firelord, still the master of flame, still the most terrible force in all the elemental plane. The Titans might have banished him, but they could not break him. But even in exile, Ragnaros's fury did not diminish. If anything, it grew, fed by eons of humiliation and defeat. He had been enslaved by the old gods, forced to serve beings who had no right to command him. Then he had been banished by the Titans, cast out of the world he had ruled since before time had meaning. He who had been a force of nature since the dawn of creation had been treated as nothing more than a problem to be contained, a nuisance to be locked away and forgotten. The Fire Lord's hatred burned hotter than the flames of his domain, and he began to plot his return. He knew that the barriers between worlds were not truly eternal. Magic could create them, and magic could unmake them. Somewhere, somehow, a weakness would appear in the walls of his prison, and when it did, Ragnaros would be ready. The elemental plane was meant to be a place of eternal imprisonment, but it was also a realm unto itself, a dimension where the elements could exist without interfering with the mortal world. In this strange exile, the elemental lords found themselves in close proximity for the first time since their defeat, separated by the boundaries of their respective domains, but aware of one another's presence in ways they had not been when they roamed freely across Azeroth. It was perhaps inevitable that the old conflicts would resume. Without a common enemy to unite them, without the old gods to bind their wills, the elemental lords reverted to their natural state of warfare. The boundaries between their domains became battlefields, places where fire met water, where earth clashed with air, where the fundamental forces of creation struggled for supremacy. For 5 millennia, this conflict raged. The elemental sundering, as it would come to be known, was a war of unprecedented ferocity, fought not for territory or resources, but for pride, for vengeance, for the simple satisfaction of inflicting suffering upon those who had been enemies since before time had meaning. It was during the elemental sundering that Ragnaros achieved one of his greatest victories. Thunderaan, the Prince of Air, was the son of Alakir and one of the mightiest air elementals to ever exist. He was known as the Windseeker, a being of such speed and power that he could traverse the entirety of the skywall in the time it took most elementals to draw breath. His control over wind and lightning was unmatched among air elementals, second only to his father in raw power. Thunderaan had grown arrogant during the elemental sundering, emboldened by a string of victories against fire elementals who had strayed too close to the borders of the skywall. He began to believe that he might succeed where his father had failed, that he might strike down the hated Firelord and claim glory that would elevate him above all other air elementals. With a force of his most loyal followers, Thunderaan ventured into the contested regions between the elemental domains, seeking to draw Ragnaros into a confrontation. The Firelord was all too happy to oblige. He had been watching Thunderaan's rising confidence with patient interest, allowing the young prince to win battle after battle, feeding his pride until it overwhelmed his caution. When Thunderaan finally ventured close enough to the Firelands, Ragnaros struck with devastating force. The battle between Ragnaros and Thunderaan was a cataclysm that reshaped the very boundaries of the elemental plane. Fire and air collided in explosions that could be felt in every corner of the dimension. Ragnaros summoned walls of flame that sought to contain his enemy, while Thunderaan called down lightning storms of unprecedented fury. The clash sent shockwaves through the barriers separating the elemental domains, briefly weakening walls that the Titans had meant to last forever. Thunderaan was fast, perhaps the fastest being in all the elemental plane. He struck at Ragnaros from a dozen directions in the span of a single moment, his blade of compressed wind leaving trails of vapor that twisted in impossible spirals. But speed alone was not enough against an enemy who could fill the very air with fire. Ragnaros turned Thunderaan's swiftness against him, creating infernos that the prince had to dodge, forcing him into patterns that the Firelord could predict and exploit. The turning point came when Ragnaros managed to land a devastating blow with Sulfuras. The hammer connected with Thunderaan's crystalline form, and the impact shattered the prince's defenses entirely. In that moment of vulnerability, Ragnaros unleashed everything he had, a concentrated beam of elemental fire that consumed Thunderaan where he hovered. In the end, Thunderaan was utterly defeated. The Prince of Air was no match for the Firelord's combination of patience, power, and cunning. Ragnaros feasted upon his essence, consuming the life force of his fallen foe in a display of elemental dominance that had not been seen since the age of the old gods. The Windseeker's screams echoed through the elemental plane, a sound that haunted air elementals for generations afterward. But even the Firelord could not absorb Thunderaan entirely. Some fragment of the Wind Prince remained, too resilient to be destroyed, too fundamental to be consumed completely. The essence of a being as powerful as Thunderaan could not simply be annihilated. It had to go somewhere, and Ragnaros found himself unable to fully integrate it into his own being. Ragnaros divided what remained of Thunderaan between two of his most trusted lieutenants. Baron Geddon, a powerful fire elemental who served as one of Ragnaros's generals and whose flames burned with particular intensity, received a portion of the essence. The fragment of the Windseeker's power enhanced Geddon's own abilities, making him more volatile and dangerous than ever before. Gar, a massive entity composed of obsidian and flame, who commanded legions of lesser elementals, received the rest. Together, they were tasked with guarding the remnants of Thunderaan, ensuring that the Prince of Air could never reform and challenge the Firelord again. The binding was accomplished through rituals of fire and will, dark ceremonies that locked Thunderaan's essence into containers of elemental power. As long as Baron Geddon and Gar existed, the Windseeker would remain trapped, his consciousness fragmented and helpless. It was a fate worse than death for a being who had once soared freely through endless skies. This victory established Ragnaros' dominance within the elemental plane. While he could not challenge the other elemental lords in their own domains, none dared to venture into the Firelands or the contested territories that bordered them. Alakir, devastated by the loss of his son, withdrew to the far reaches of the Skywall and nursed his hatred in silence. The Windlord's grief was terrible to behold, a storm of rage and sorrow that never fully subsided. He swore vengeance against Ragnaros, but he knew that such vengeance would have to wait for an opportunity that might never come. The message was clear: cross Ragnaros and face annihilation. For countless years after the elemental sundering, Ragnaros ruled his domain with an iron fist encased in living flame. Sulfuron Keep grew ever more magnificent, a fortress of such terrible beauty that even other fire elementals approached it with awe. The lake of fire at its base never cooled, never solidified, maintained at temperatures that would vaporize mortal flesh in an instant. Here the Firelord sat upon his throne, surrounded by his most loyal servants, plotting and scheming and waiting. He knew that the boundaries between worlds were not eternal. He knew that someday, somehow, a path would open between the elemental plane and Azeroth. And when that day came, he would return to the world from which he had been banished, and his vengeance would be complete. The opportunity for Ragnaros' return came not from his own machinations, but from the hubris of mortals. On Azeroth, thousands of years had passed since the elemental lords had been banished. Civilizations had risen and fallen, races had evolved and developed, and the world had become unrecognizable from the chaos of the primordial age. Among the mortals who now inhabited Azeroth were the dwarves, a race descended from the Titan-forged who had once helped banish the elementals. They had no memory of their creator's origins, having succumbed to the curse of flesh that transformed them from beings of living stone into creatures of meat and bone. But they retained the industrious nature of their ancestors, the love of crafting and building that had characterized the Titan-forged. The dwarves had built a great kingdom beneath the mountain of Ironforge, ruled by the High King Modimus Anvilmar. For generations, they prospered in relative peace, their society divided into three major clans: the Bronzebeard clan, masters of smithing and warfare; the Wildhammer clan, who loved the open sky and the companionship of griffins; and the Dark Iron clan, who delved deeper than any others and practiced forbidden magics. When High King Modimus Anvilmar died without a clear heir, the fragile unity of the dwarven people shattered like glass struck by a hammer. Each clan believed they had the right to rule, their claims supported by generations of service and sacrifice. None was willing to submit to the others, for to do so would be to admit inferiority, to accept a position of subservience that no proud dwarf could tolerate. The War of the Three Hammers began, a brutal civil war that would reshape the mountains themselves and inadvertently release a horror that the dwarves could never have imagined. At first, it was a conflict of words and political maneuvering, each clan trying to gather allies and position themselves for advantage. But words gave way to weapons, and soon the blood of dwarves stained the stones of Ironforge itself. The Bronzebeard clan, led by Madarin Bronzebeard, held the mountain fortress of Ironforge and commanded the largest and best equipped army. They were master smiths and warriors, their soldiers armored in steel, forged in the great furnaces that burned at the heart of the mountain. Their weapons were legendary, their discipline unmatched. The Wildhammer clan, under Cardros Wildhammer, had established their stronghold at Grim Batol in the wetlands to the east. They were fierce warriors in their own right, but their true strength lay in their bond with the griffins that made their home in the peaks surrounding their fortress. From the sky, the Wildhammers could strike anywhere, their storm hammers crackling with lightning as they dove upon their enemies. The Dark Iron clan, ruled by sorcerer Thane Thorison and his wife, the sorceress Modgud, had retreated to the south, to the Red Ridge Mountains, where they had established their own kingdom. They were the smallest of the three clans, the least militarily powerful, but they commanded magics that the other clans viewed with suspicion and fear. The war went poorly for the Dark Iron clan from the beginning. Thorison divided his forces, sending Modgud to assault Grim Batol while he led an attack against Ironforge itself. It was a bold strategy, meant to prevent the other two clans from uniting against them, but it stretched the Dark Iron forces too thin. Modgud's assault on Grim Batol was initially successful. Her dark magics allowed her to penetrate the fortress's defenses, and her soldiers fought with desperate fury. But Cardros Wildhammer led his Griffin riders in a devastating counterattack, and Modgud herself was slain in the fighting. With her death, the Dark Iron assault on Grim Batol collapsed. Thorison's attack on Ironforge fared no better. Madoran Bronzebeard's defenses held firm against everything the Dark Iron sorcerers could throw at them, and when the Wildhammers arrived as reinforcements, fresh from their victory at Grim Battle, the tide turned completely. Thorison was forced to retreat, his army shattered, his ambitions in ruins. The combined forces of the Bronzebeard and Wildhammer clans pursued the fleeing Dark Irons south, intent on ending the threat once and for all. The Dark Iron capital of Thorison, located in the Red Ridge Mountains, became the target of a siege that the weakened clan could not hope to survive. The end was coming, and everyone knew it. Sorcerer Thane Thorison, now a widower who had lost his wife, his army, and his hope, grew desperate beyond reason. His people faced annihilation, their kingdom on the verge of complete destruction. He had tried every stratagem, every spell, every cunning plan he could devise, but nothing could stop the inexorable advance of his enemies. In his desperation, Thorison turned to the darkest magics his people had ever discovered, magics that had been forbidden for good reason. Deep beneath the Red Ridge Mountains, ancient forces slumbered. Thorison had learned of these powers through forbidden texts and dangerous rituals, whispers of entities so old that they predated this dwarven race by countless millennia. He did not fully understand what he was attempting to summon, only that it would be powerful enough to destroy his enemies once and for all. The ritual was performed in the depths of the Dark Iron Kingdom, surrounded by the greatest sorcerers of the clan. They chanted words of power that had not been spoken since the age of the Black Empire, drew symbols in blood that burned with unnatural light, and called out to the sleeping fire beneath the world. They were more successful than they could have possibly imagined. Ragnaros the Firelord, imprisoned for over 10,000 years in the elemental plane, felt the summoning like a crack of thunder in eternal silence. For the first time since his banishment, a path opened between his prison and the world from which he had been exiled. The bonds that held him in the Firelands weakened, stretched, and finally snapped. The Firelord's return to Azeroth was apocalyptic in the truest sense of the word. The magical energies released by Thunderan's ritual combined with Ragnaros' own terrible power to create a cataclysm of unprecedented scale. The Redridge Mountains themselves were shattered, blown apart by forces that the earth could not contain. The very landscape was remade in an instant of devastating violence. Where the dark iron capital had stood, a massive volcano erupted, piercing the sky with a column of fire and ash that could be seen for hundreds of miles. This was Blackrock Mountain, born from the catastrophic fusion of elemental power and dwarven sorcery. The entire region was transformed into a volcanic hellscape, a wound in the world that would never truly heal. Thunderaan himself was killed instantly, vaporized by the forces he had unleashed. He had succeeded in summoning Ragnaros, but he had not lived long enough to see the consequences of his actions. Perhaps that was a mercy, for what followed would have broken even the most ambitious sorcerer's heart. Ragnaros, ripped into the physical world after millennia of imprisonment, was not grateful to those who had freed him. He was not an ally to be commanded or a weapon to be directed. He was a force of nature, an embodiment of destruction, and he immediately set about asserting his dominance over everything within his reach. The surviving dark iron dwarves found themselves in a nightmare beyond their worst fears. They had sought salvation through forbidden magic, and instead they had doomed themselves to servitude, far worse than any defeat at the hands of their dwarven kin. Ragnaros looked upon these mortals who had freed him not with gratitude, but with contempt. In his rage, Ragnaros enslaved the Dark Iron clan entirely. They who had been proud sorcerers, cunning warriors, independent to the point of self-destruction, were now nothing more than tools of the Firelord. Their will was bent to his purposes, their lives given in service to his flames. Those who resisted were consumed, those who submitted were allowed to exist, though existence under Ragnaros' rule was hardly a blessing. The Dark Irons were put to work immediately. Blackrock Mountain, the massive volcano that had been created by Ragnaros' arrival, became his new seat of power on Azeroth. Deep within its fiery core, the dwarves began constructing the Molten Core, a vast complex of chambers and passages that would serve as Ragnaros' throne room and the gateway between Azeroth and the Firelands. The architecture of the Molten Core was both magnificent and terrible. Rivers of molten rock flowed through carved channels, providing light and heat beyond anything that should have been survivable. Massive chambers were hewn from the volcanic stone, spaces large enough to accommodate Ragnaros' massive form. At the center of it all was a lake of fire, a pool of magma kept at temperatures so extreme that even the air above it could kill. Here, Ragnaros established his court, surrounding himself with fire elementals summoned from the Firelands and the enslaved dark iron dwarves who served his every whim. His lieutenants took up positions throughout the Molten Core, each one a being of tremendous power in their own right. Baron Geddon prowled the outer chambers, still carrying within him a portion of Thunderaan's essence. Gar commanded legions of elite guards, his obsidian form housing the rest of the fallen Wind Prince. Other beings of power gathered to serve the Firelord. Lucifron, a flame waker of terrible intelligence, became one of Ragnaros' chief advisors. Gehennas, surrounded by his personal guard of flamewakers, watched over the approaches to the inner sanctum. Shazra, a creature whose mastery of arcane fire was unmatched, patrolled the deeper reaches. Sulfuron Harbinger, who bore a name honoring the Firelord's seat of power in the elemental plane, served as Ragnaros' herald. And then there was Golemog the Incinerator, a massive core hound whose flames burned hot enough to reduce stone to slag. And finally, Majordomo Executus, the highest-ranking non-elemental servant of Ragnaros, a flamewaker who had been elevated to a position of trust and power exceeded only by the Firelord himself. The Dark Iron dwarves were not merely slaves. Over time, they became worshippers. This transformation did not happen overnight. At first, the surviving Dark Irons served Ragnaros out of fear, doing his bidding because the alternative was death. They watched their companions be consumed by flames when they displeased the Firelord, saw entire families reduced to ash for the smallest infractions. But fear can only motivate for so long. The second generation of Dark Irons, those born in the depths of Blackrock Mountain, knew no other life. They had never seen the sun, never felt the cool breeze of the surface, never experienced anything except the eternal heat and the absolute power of Ragnaros. To them, the Firelord was not a tyrant, but a god, a being of infinite power who had created the world they knew and sustained it with his flames. The third generation took this devotion even further. They built temples in Ragnaros' honor, elaborate structures carved from the volcanic rock and decorated with obsidian and fire opals. They carved prayers to his glory into the walls, liturgies praising the cleansing power of flame, the purifying nature of fire. They developed complex rituals and ceremonies, sacrificial practices that claimed the lives of their own people to feed the Firelord's endless hunger. These sacrifices were not seen as murder, but as honor. To be chosen for immolation was considered the highest privilege, a chance to become one with the flames that the Dark Irons had come to worship above all else. Families would compete for the honor of having their children selected, viewing it as proof of their devotion and faith. This cult-like devotion served Ragnaros well. The Dark Irons worked tirelessly to expand his domain, to dig deeper into the mountain, to create ever more elaborate tributes to his magnificence. They forged weapons and armor in his name, imbuing each piece with elemental fire through rituals that required blood and flame in equal measure. They created items of power infused with the essence of the Firelands itself, artifacts that would be coveted by adventurers for generations to come. Ironically, their enslavement made the Dark Irons some of the most skilled smiths in all of Azeroth, working in conditions that would kill most craftsmen instantly. They learned to manipulate metals at temperatures that no other race could achieve. Their techniques, born from necessity and refined through centuries of practice, produced weapons and armor of unmatched quality. The very suffering that defined their existence had made them masters of their craft. For over 200 years, Ragnaros ruled from the depths of Blackrock Mountain. His influence spread throughout the region, corrupting the land and making it uninhabitable for all but the most resilient creatures. The burning steppes, the region surrounding the volcano, became a wasteland of scorched earth and toxic fumes. The searing gorge to the north was little better, its very soil infused with heat that never dissipated. The slopes of the volcano became home to fire elementals who spilled out from the molten core, lesser servants of Ragnaros who could not contain their energy within the mountain's depths. Dragons of the black dragonflight, corrupted by the old god Zoth, made their lair in the upper reaches of Blackrock Mountain, creating a bizarre symbiosis between flame and shadow that neither side fully controlled. During this time, the Firelord bided his time and rebuilt his strength. He drew power from the volcanic forces that surrounded him, feeding on the magma that flowed beneath the mountain, growing stronger with each passing year. He was not satisfied with ruling merely a mountain. His ambitions extended to all of Azeroth and beyond. He remembered his time as a ruler of the primordial world, when his flames had covered continents, when nothing could stand before his fury. He remembered his humiliation at the hands of the Titans, how Tyr and Odin had brought him low. He remembered his enslavement by the old gods, how he had been forced to serve beings who had no right to command him, and he swore that when his power was fully restored, he would have his revenge on all who had ever dared to oppose him. The Firelord's dominion over Blackrock Mountain might have continued unchallenged for centuries more had it not been for the interference of mortal heroes. In the years following the Third War, when the world was still recovering from the devastation wrought by the Burning Legion and the Scourge, adventurers began to grow in power and ambition. They formed groups dedicated to confronting the great threats that menaced Azeroth, and eventually their attention turned to the fire that burned within Blackrock Mountain. The first forays into the molten core were disasters. Groups of heroes entered the volcanic depths, confident in their abilities, and were consumed by flames before they even reached the first of Ragnaros' lieutenants. The heat alone was enough to kill the unprepared, and those who survived long enough to face the elemental guardians found themselves hopelessly outmatched. But mortals are nothing if not persistent. The heroes learned from their failures, adapted their tactics, gathered better equipment. They studied the patterns of the elementals, identified weaknesses in their defenses, and gradually began to push deeper into the molten core. Each expedition went a little farther, claimed a few more victories, and brought back knowledge that would prove invaluable to those who came after. The battles against Ragnaros' lieutenants became legendary in their own right. Lucifron fell first, his intelligence no match for the cunning of mortal tacticians who had learned to coordinate their attacks perfectly. Gehenna's and his guards followed, overwhelmed by concentrated magical assaults that exploited their vulnerability to frost. One by one, the defenders of the molten core were defeated. Baron Geddon proved particularly dangerous, his volatile nature making him unpredictable in battle. He would suddenly ignite with explosive fury, detonating with enough force to kill anyone standing too close. The heroes learned to watch for the signs, to scatter when the explosion was imminent, and eventually they brought him down. With his death, the first portion of Thunderaan's essence was freed, though it would be some time before anyone realized its significance. Gar was a different sort of challenge entirely. The massive elemental was surrounded by 8 smaller servants, each one a formidable enemy in its own right. These fire-sworn guards had to be dealt with simultaneously, or nearly so, for if any were allowed to survive too long, they would empower Gar beyond what the heroes could handle. The coordination required to defeat him was immense, requiring precise timing and devastating area attacks that could weaken all the adds at once. The massive obsidian elemental himself was a terror to behold. His form was composed of volcanic glass and living fire, standing taller than the largest orc warrior, wider than two dwarven defenders standing shoulder to shoulder. When he moved, the ground shook with each step, and when he struck, his blows could shatter shields and crack armor. But the heroes had learned from their previous encounters, and they had come prepared. They separated the Firesworn, assigned specific targets to specific groups, and through careful coordination brought them all down within moments of each other. With his guards destroyed, Gar became vulnerable. The heroes surrounded him, their weapons enchanted against fire, their armor warded with frost runes. They attacked from all angles, never giving the massive elemental a chance to focus on any single target. The battle was brutal and costly, but defeat him they did, and another fragment of the Wind Prince's essence was released. The deeper chambers of the molten core held even greater challenges. Shazra the Gatekeeper prowled areas where the arcane and the elemental intertwined, his mastery of magical fire making him a nightmare for spellcasters to face. He could blink across the battlefield in an instant, appearing suddenly behind a healer or mage and unleashing devastating attacks before vanishing again. His curse could silence magic users entirely, leaving them helpless as his flames consumed them. The heroes learned to anticipate his teleportation, to watch for the subtle shift in reality that preceded each blink. They developed signals, quick calls that would warn their companions when Shazra was about to move. Slowly, painfully, they whittled down his defenses and brought him low. Golemag the Incinerator was perhaps the most physically imposing creature the heroes faced before Ragnaros himself. This massive core hound was a beast of pure elemental fury, twin heads that belched flames hot enough to melt steel, a body that radiated heat intense enough to cause pain from dozens of feet away. Two molten giants flanked him, each one a formidable enemy that had to be dealt with before the core hound could be approached safely. The battle against Golemag tested the hero's endurance like nothing before. His flames never stopped, wave after wave of fire that washed over the chamber in regular intervals. Those who could not find shelter behind magical barriers or physical cover simply died, their bodies reduced to ash in moments. The healers worked frantically, pouring every ounce of power they possessed into keeping the defenders alive. But even Golemag fell. His twin heads crashed to the ground one after the other, his massive body collapsing into a heap of cooling obsidian and dying flames. The path to the inner sanctum was open at last. Sulfuron Harbinger awaited them in the chamber before Ragnaros' throne room. This Flamewaker was attended by 4 priests, healers who would constantly restore their master's health unless they were dealt with first. The priests had to be neutralized quickly, their casting interrupted or their attention diverted, while the main force engaged Sulfuron himself. The Harbinger was a warrior of terrible skill, his weapon wreathed in flames that burned hotter than any ordinary fire. He called down meteors from the volcanic ceiling, creating craters of molten rock that forced the heroes to constantly reposition. His inspiring presence made the priests fight even harder, heal even faster, making the battle a race against attrition. Victory came at a terrible cost. Many heroes fell in that chamber, their bodies too damaged by flame to be restored even by the most powerful resurrection magic. Those who survived pushed forward, knowing that their fallen companions would want them to finish what they had started. And then, at last, they reached Major Domo Executus. Executus was perhaps the most cunning of all the Firelord's servants, and he did not face the invaders alone. 8 Flamewaker healers surrounded him, powerful beings capable of mending his wounds almost as fast as the heroes could inflict them. The battle was one of attrition, a test of whether the mortals could deal damage faster than it could be repaired. The Major Domo himself was a master tactician, directing his healers with precision while avoiding the most dangerous attacks. He would teleport across the chamber, staying out of reach while his servants whittled down the hero's resources. His fire magic was relentless, a constant barrage of flames that tested even the most experienced defenders. The key to victory lay in eliminating the healers first. The heroes had to split their forces, dedicating separate groups to each healer while preventing Executus from interfering. It required coordination that bordered on impossible, communication that happened in split seconds, trust that had been forged through countless previous battles. Slowly, one by one, the healers fell. Without his support, Major Domo Executus found himself overwhelmed. The combined might of the heroes crashed against him like waves against a cliff, and for all his cunning, he could not withstand their assault. When his defeat became inevitable, Executus surrendered, falling to his knees before the very mortals he had sought to destroy. In the end, the heroes prevailed. Major Domo Executus was forced to submit, and in his defeat, he performed one final service for his master. He approached the lake of fire at the heart of the molten core and began to chant, his words echoing with power accumulated over centuries. The surface of the magma began to churn, bubbles of superheated gas rising and bursting in increasingly violent eruptions. And then Ragnaros rose. The Firelord emerged from the lake of fire like a god arising from the primordial chaos. His upper body was a massive humanoid form, muscular and terrible, composed entirely of living flame. His lower body remained submerged in the magma, connected to the lake itself, as though the molten rock was an extension of his being. In one hand, he clutched Sulphurus, Hand of Ragnaros, a legendary hammer wreathed in eternal flame. His voice, when he spoke, was like the roar of 1,000 volcanoes erupting at once. Words that had been quoted countless times in the years since, words that would become legendary among the adventurers of Azeroth. The Firelord's declaration of his intention to purge the mortals before him with fire was not a threat, but a statement of absolute certainty. The battle against Ragnaros was unlike anything the heroes had experienced. The heat radiating from his form was intense enough to harm them just by proximity. His hammer strikes could crush the mightiest warriors in a single blow. When he called down fire from above, the entire chamber became an inferno that left no safe place to stand. But the heroes had come too far to fail. They had defeated every lieutenant, overcome every obstacle, and they refused to yield before the Firelord himself. They dodged his attacks with desperate agility, healed their wounds with magic pushed to its absolute limits, and struck back with every weapon at their disposal. The tank who held Ragnaros's attention was perhaps the bravest among them, standing directly before the Firelord and absorbing attacks that would have instantly killed anyone else. Their armor, enchanted with the most powerful fire resistance available, glowed cherry red from the heat. Their shield, blessed by priests and shamans before the battle, began to warp and crack under the relentless assault. Yet they held their ground, because to falter would mean death for everyone. Behind the tank, warriors and rogues struck at Ragnaros' flanks, their weapons enhanced with frost magic to counter the Firelord's flames. Each strike sent plumes of steam rising from the elemental's body, droplets of liquid fire spattering in all directions. The melee fighters had to constantly balance their aggression against the need to avoid being immolated by Ragnaros' counterattacks. The ranged attackers stood at the edge of the platform, as far from Ragnaros as they could manage, while still hitting him with their spells and arrows. Mages channeled blizzards and ice lances, their frost magic the most effective weapon against the Lord of Fire. Warlocks summoned shadows and curses, their dark magic finding purchase even against a being of pure elemental power. Hunters peppered the Firelord with arrows, each shaft enchanted to resist burning until it struck its target. And the healers worked miracles throughout it all. Priests called upon the light to mend wounds that should have been fatal. Druids channeled the power of nature to restore flesh that had been charred beyond recognition. Shamans drew upon the elements themselves, turning even the fire that surrounded them into a source of restoration rather than destruction. Without them, the battle would have ended in the first minute. The battle lasted longer than any that had come before. Ragnaros seemed limitless in his fury, his power fed by the volcanic forces that surrounded them. When he raised Sulphurus high and slammed it into the ground, the entire platform shook with such force that heroes were knocked from their feet. When he called down fireballs from the burning sky above, the healers had to prioritize who would live and who would die, because they simply could not save everyone. But gradually, impossibly, the heroes began to gain the upper hand. Their attacks found weaknesses in the Firelord's defenses. Their coordination allowed them to avoid his most devastating blows. The tide of battle shifted. Ragnaros' flames began to flicker, his movement slowing as the accumulated damage took its toll. When Ragnaros finally fell, when his form collapsed back into the lake of fire from which he had emerged, the heroes hardly dared to believe it. The Firelord, one of the most ancient and powerful beings in existence, had been defeated by mortals. It seemed impossible, yet they had witnessed it with their own eyes. The chamber fell silent except for the bubbling of magma and the ragged breathing of the survivors. But Ragnaros was not destroyed. The heroes had not been fighting the Firelord in his own realm. They had faced him in a place where his power, while immense, was not absolute. When his physical form was defeated in the molten core, Ragnaros was merely banished, forced back to the Firelands, where he had been imprisoned for so long. For the Firelord, this was yet another humiliation to add to the list. First the old gods had enslaved him, then the Titans had banished him, and now mortals, beings whose entire civilizations were barely a blink in the eye of his eternal existence, had defeated him on the world he had sworn to conquer. His rage, already boundless, found new fuel. Years passed after Ragnaros' defeat in the molten core. The heroes who had banished him went on to face other threats, other challenges that demanded their attention. They confronted the corrupted dragon Onyxia in her lair. They ventured into the necropolis of Naxxramas to face the lich Kel'Thuzad. They entered the temple of Ahan-Kiraj to battle the remnants of the old god Sethun's influence. They traveled to Outland to fight the Burning Legion itself. Through all of these conflicts, the Firelord was thought to be contained, trapped once again in the Firelands, no longer an immediate threat to Azeroth. The molten core still existed, of course, and some dark iron dwarves remained loyal to their imprisoned master, but without Ragnaros himself, the threat had been reduced to a manageable level. Other dangers took priority, but such assumptions underestimated both Ragnaros's patience and the volatility of the world itself. In the Firelands, the Firelord plotted and planned, rebuilding his forces, strengthening the defenses of Sulfuron Keep. He had been humiliated twice now, first by his banishment to the elemental plane, and then by his defeat at the hands of mortal adventurers. He would not be humiliated a third time. The years of waiting were not idle. Ragnaros summoned new lieutenants to serve him, fire elementals of tremendous power who had proven their loyalty through centuries of service. He forged alliances with other beings of flame, creatures who had their own reasons to hate the mortal world. He studied the heroes who had defeated him, learning their tactics and their weaknesses, preparing countermeasures for when they would inevitably clash again. The Firelord's intelligence network spread across Azeroth through the flames themselves. Every candle, every hearth fire, every torch that burned in the mortal world became a potential window through which Ragnaros could observe his enemies. His servants whispered to him of political changes, of new heroes rising to prominence, of the conflicts that occupied the attention of those who had once defeated him. He learned of the opening of the Dark Portal and the expedition to Outland. He watched as the heroes who had banished him grew stronger through their conflicts with the Burning Legion. He observed the war against the Lich King in Northrend, noting how the mortals had developed new tactics, new equipment, new abilities that made them even more formidable than before. Each observation was catalogued, analyzed, and incorporated into Ragnaros's plans. He was no longer the being who had been surprised by mortal ingenuity in the molten core. He understood now that these short-lived creatures were capable of achievements that even elemental lords should respect. Not admire, never admire, but respect in the way that a hunter respects dangerous prey. New weapons were forged in the depths of the Firelands, artifacts of terrible power that would give Ragnaros advantages he had not possessed before. New tactics were developed, strategies designed specifically to counter the methods that had proven effective against him. New lieutenants were elevated to positions of power, beings whose loyalty had been tested and confirmed through ordeals of fire. And through it all, he waited for the moment when the barriers between worlds would weaken enough for him to return. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part for a being of Ragnaros's temperament. Fire is not patient by nature. Fire wants to consume, to spread, to grow. Every instinct in Ragnaros's elemental being demanded immediate action, immediate revenge, immediate destruction. But he had learned the value of patience through bitter experience. His premature emergence in the molten core had left him vulnerable, had allowed mortals to defeat him when he should have been invincible. This time, he would wait until the moment was perfect. This time, nothing would be left to chance. The cataclysm changed everything. Deathwing the Destroyer, formerly Neltharion the Earth Warder, had been one of the 5 dragon aspects empowered by the Titans to protect Azeroth. He had been the most powerful of the 5, entrusted with dominion over the deep places of the earth. But the old gods had found him, had whispered to him through the darkness, had slowly corrupted his mind until nothing remained of the noble guardian he had once been. For millennia, Deathwing had hidden in Deepholm, the elemental realm of Earth, recovering from wounds he had sustained in his last attempt to destroy Azeroth. The old god whispers never ceased, driving him to madness, promising him power beyond imagining if only he would complete the task they had set for him. When he finally emerged from his long slumber, it was to reshape the world in ways that had not been seen since the Sundering itself. Deathwing broke free from Deepholm and tore through the elemental barriers that separated the planes. His emergence into Azeroth was catastrophic beyond description. The maelstrom, the swirling vortex of energy at the center of the world, surged with power as the boundaries between dimensions collapsed. Continents shifted, coastlines changed, entire regions were transformed by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Thousand Needles flooded, the towering mesas now rising from an inland sea where dry desert had stood for millennia. Desolus saw forests rise where nothing had grown before. The barrens split in two, sundered by great fissures that revealed the molten heart of the world. Aberdeen was destroyed, the night elven settlement swept away by waves that reshaped the entire coastline. Among the consequences of Deathwing's return was a weakening of the boundaries between Azeroth and the elemental plane. The barriers that had kept the elements contained for thousands of years were damaged by the cataclysm, cracks appearing in walls that had been thought unbreakable. Portals that had been sealed for ages suddenly flickered to life. Elementals that had been contained for generations found themselves able to cross over to the mortal world with unprecedented ease. And Ragnaros, who had been waiting for exactly such an opportunity since his defeat in the Molten Core, prepared to make his return. The Firelord felt the barriers weaken and knew that his time had finally come. After years of patience, after centuries of planning, he would once again set foot upon the world he had sworn to consume. In Sulfuron Keep, the Firelord summoned his most trusted advisors, Flamewakers who had served him since before the banishment gathered in his throne room, their flames flickering with anticipation as they sensed their master's excitement. For the first time in years, Ragnaros spoke not of waiting, but of action. The barriers were weakening. The mortal defenders were distracted by the cataclysm that was reshaping their world. The time to strike was at hand. Plans that had been theoretical for centuries were now put into motion. Ragnaros had spent his long imprisonment well, studying the world he sought to conquer through the eyes of fire elementals who had managed to slip through the weakened barriers over the years. He knew the layout of the surface world, understood its defenses, had identified its vulnerabilities. Most importantly, he knew exactly where to strike for maximum devastation. The Firelord's army had grown during his imprisonment as well. Fire elementals from across the Firelands had gathered under his banner, drawn by his unmatched power and his promise of eventual conquest. Flamewakers bred in the heat of Sulfuron Keep had multiplied over generations, their numbers now vast beyond counting. Creatures of living magma, that had never before existed had been created through Ragnaros' experiments, new weapons in his arsenal of destruction. But Ragnaros knew that even his formidable forces might not be enough to conquer Azeroth alone. The mortals had proven surprisingly resourceful in the past, and the other elemental lords might oppose his ambitions if given the chance. He needed allies, powerful beings who shared his desire to see the world burn. And so, when the opportunity presented itself, he accepted an alliance that would have been unthinkable in earlier ages. The Firelord was not alone in his ambitions. The Twilight's Hammer cult, fanatics dedicated to the old gods and the end of all things, had been working to facilitate Deathwing's plans for years. They recognized in Ragnaros a powerful ally, a being whose destructive capabilities could help bring about the hour of twilight that they so desperately sought. They approached the Firelord with an offer he found impossible to refuse. The old gods themselves reached out to Ragnaros, promising him something that made even his ancient pride stir with interest. If he would serve their purposes once more, if he would help bring about the destruction of Azeroth, they would ensure that he could burn the world without interference. Neptulon and Therazane would not be allowed to oppose him. The waters would not quench his flames. The earth would not smother his fires. He would be free to consume everything. It was a tempting offer, and Ragnaros accepted. He had not forgotten his enslavement by the old gods in the ancient past, but his hatred for the world that had rejected him outweighed his resentment of his former masters. If serving them meant getting his revenge, then he would serve. And once Azeroth was burning, once his victory was complete, he would deal with the old gods in his own time. The target of Ragnaros' assault was Mount Hejael, the sacred mountain where the world tree Nordrassil grew. This tree was of immense significance, not just to the night elves who tended it, but to the world itself. It had been planted by the dragon aspects at the end of the War of the Ancients, nearly 10,000 years ago, and blessed with their power to serve as a guardian of the world. Nordrassil's roots reached deep into the earth, touching the very essence of Azeroth, connecting with the ley lines that carried magical energy across the planet. Its branches stretched toward the sky, reaching into realms beyond mortal understanding, touching the emerald dream and maintaining the balance between waking and sleeping worlds. For millennia, it had granted the night elves immortality, though that blessing had been sacrificed to stop the previous invasion of the Burning Legion. To burn Nordrassil would be to strike at the heart of all that lived. The destruction of the World Tree would send shockwaves through the magical fabric of Azeroth, destabilizing forces that had been in careful balance since the dawn of recorded history. It was a target worthy of the Firelord's ambition, a prize that would prove his supremacy over all the forces that had ever opposed him. The Firelord's armies poured through portals connecting the Firelands to Hejael. Fire elementals by the thousands emerged onto the sacred slopes, their very presence igniting the ancient forests that had stood since before the Sundering. Trees that had witnessed the birth of civilizations went up in flames within moments, their 1,000-year-old trunks reduced to ash in seconds. The Flame Wakers, who had served Ragnaros for centuries, led the assault, coordinating the elemental forces with military precision honed over millennia of warfare. They had learned from their defeat in the Molten Core, had developed new tactics, to counter the strategies that mortals had used against them. This time, they would not be caught off guard. Behind them came beings of even greater power, lieutenants of the Firelord who had been preparing for this moment for years. Massive fire elementals whose forms burned with the intensity of small suns. Creatures of molten rock whose very footsteps melted the ground beneath them. An army of flame and fury unleashed upon a world that had dared to defy their master. The defenders of Hijal were caught off guard by the scale of the assault. The Guardians of Hijal, an organization dedicated to protecting the sacred mountain, had expected threats. They had prepared defenses, gathered allies, trained their followers in the arts of combat, but they had not expected this. The sheer number of fire elementals pouring through the portals, the intensity of the flames that consumed everything they touched, the coordinated brutality of the attack, all of it exceeded their worst projections. The Cenarian Circle, druids who had tended the world tree for millennia, watched in horror as their home began to burn. These were beings who had devoted their lives to the preservation of nature, who could feel the pain of every tree as it was consumed, who shared a connection with the forest that made its destruction feel like physical agony. Many of them threw themselves into battle despite impossible odds, preferring death to watching helplessly as everything they loved was destroyed. It seemed as though nothing could stop Ragnaros' advance. The flames spread faster than any natural fire, driven by elemental will rather than mere combustion. Water evaporated before it could quench the conflagration. Earth was melted into slag by the intensity of the heat. Even the air itself seemed to feed the fire rather than suffocate it. But the defenders were not without resources. As the situation grew desperate, the druids of the Cenarian Circle turned to allies that had slumbered for ages, beings whose power had been preserved in the Emerald Dream against a time of great need. Goldrin, the great white wolf whose spirit had been bound to the Emerald Dream, awakened to defend the land. This ancient being was the father of all wolves, a creature of such primal power that his howl could shake the very foundations of the world. His spirit form manifested on the slopes of Hijal, and where he ran, the fire elementals found themselves facing an opponent they had not anticipated. Aviana, the mistress of birds whose physical form had been shattered in ancient battles, was restored by the druid's magic. She had been the first avian, the mother of all creatures of flight, and her power over the skies was absolute. She called upon the winds to fight against the flames, directing currents of air that starved the fire of oxygen, even as they cleared paths for the defenders to advance. Tortola, the great turtle whose shell had carried the first forests, emerged from his long slumber to add his strength to the defense. His connection to the earth itself allowed him to reshape the battlefield, raising barriers of stone that channeled the elemental assault into paths where it could be more easily contained. And most significantly of all, Cenarius himself returned. The demigod who was the son of Elune and Malorn, the lord of the forest, the patron of all druids, emerged from the Emerald Dream, where he had been recovering since his death at the hands of the corrupted Grom Hellscream. His resurrection had been the work of the entire Cenarian Circle, a ritual that had taken years to prepare and moments to complete when the need finally arose. Cenarius was perhaps the most powerful nature spirit to ever exist on Azeroth. His antlers gleamed with the light of the moon his mother had placed in the sky. His hooves left flowers blooming in his wake. His voice carried the sound of every forest that had ever grown, and when he spoke, even fire elementals paused to listen. These ancient powers joined with the mortal heroes who had answered the call to defend Hyjal. Adventurers from across Azeroth had come to the sacred mountain, drawn by the call of the Cenarian Circle and the recognition that this was a battle that could not be lost. Warriors and mages, priests and rogues, hunters and warlocks all set aside their differences to face the common threat. Together, they pushed back against Ragnaros' forces, reclaiming ground that had been lost, quenching flames that had seemed unstoppable. It was not easy. Every yard of territory cost lives, and the fire elementals were relentless in their assault. But gradually, inevitably, the tide began to turn. The defenders had proven that the Firelord could be resisted. The battle for Mount Hyjal was far from over, but hope had been rekindled. The conflict for Mount Hyjal reached a turning point when the defenders decided to take the fight to Ragnaros himself. Rather than simply defending against his endless assaults, they would invade the Firelands, strike at the Firelord in his own domain, and end the threat once and for all. This was a bold strategy, perhaps even a foolhardy one. The Firelands were Ragnaros' realm, the place where his power was absolute. Every stone, every flame, every whisper of heat belonged to him. To fight him there would be to fight him at the peak of his strength, where his enemies would be at their weakest. But there was another consideration. Hamel Rune Totem, the venerable Tauren archdruid, had studied the nature of elemental beings for decades. He understood something crucial about entities like Ragnaros. They could be banished from the mortal world, but true death could only come in their own realm. If Ragnaros was merely defeated on Azeroth again, he would simply return to the Firelands and begin plotting his next invasion. The only way to end the threat permanently was to destroy him in the Firelands itself. The Avengers of Hyjal, as the assembled heroes came to be known, prepared for the most dangerous expedition any of them had ever undertaken. They gathered the mightiest warriors, the most powerful mages, the most skilled healers available. Each member of the force was tested extensively, their abilities pushed to their absolute limits to ensure that only the strongest would make the journey. Those who failed the tests were turned away with honor, their courage acknowledged, even as their inadequacy was made clear. The preparations took weeks, every detail planned with meticulous care. Weapons and armor were crafted specifically designed to resist fire, the metals quenched in enchanted waters, the leather treated with alchemical compounds that could withstand temperatures that would reduce normal materials to ash. Runes of frost protection were carved into every piece of equipment, their magic designed to create a barrier of cold that would keep the wearer alive in the eternal inferno. Potions were stockpiled in vast quantities, elixirs that would enhance fire resistance, drafts that would regenerate health even in the most hostile environments. Bandages were woven from special fibers that would not ignite upon contact with flame. Food was prepared that would not spoil in the heat, preserved through magical means that defied natural decay. The heroes studied everything known about the Firelands, memorizing maps drawn from the memories of those who had glimpsed the realm through magical means. Shamans who had communicated with fire elementals shared what they had learned about the realm's geography, about the locations of Ragnaros' lieutenants, about the paths that might lead to Sulfuron Keep. Every scrap of information was analyzed, debated, and incorporated into the expedition's plans. Supplies were calculated with mathematical precision. The expedition would need to be self-sufficient, for there would be no reinforcements in the Firelands, no opportunity to return for forgotten equipment. Every potion, every bandage, every piece of food had to be carried through the portal and protected from the flames that awaited on the other side. The portal to the Firelands was opened at Sulfuron Spire on Mount Hyjal, a gateway carved through the barrier between worlds by the combined efforts of countless druids and shamans. The ritual took hours, the participants chanting in unison while feeding their magic into the dimensional tear. The barrier between Azeroth and the Firelands resisted, fighting against the intrusion, but the collective will of the assembled spellcasters proved stronger. When the portal finally stabilized, it was a swirling vortex of flame and shadow, a doorway to a realm that had never before been accessible to mortal kind in such numbers. The heat that radiated from it was intense enough to be felt dozens of feet away, and the light that spilled through was the golden orange of eternal fire. The heroes stepped through into a realm of eternal flame, a dimension where the sky burned with the same intensity as the ground, where rivers of magma flowed in every direction, where the very air was superheated enough to scorch the lungs of those without magical protection. The transition was disorienting, the rules of reality shifting subtly as they crossed from one plane to another. Gravity felt different here, heavier somehow, as if the realm itself was pressing down upon them. The Firelands were home to beings of incredible power, and they did not welcome the mortal invaders. The realm itself seemed to fight against the heroes, the very air searing their lungs, the ground threatening to give way beneath their feet at any moment. And guarding the paths to Ragnaros were creatures whose power rivaled anything the adventurers had faced before. Beth Tilak, a massive fire spider whose webs were made of living flame, ruled over a section of the realm with her brood of smaller spiders. She was ancient beyond mortal reckoning, a creature whose flames had burned in the Firelands since before Ragnaros himself had been banished there. Her lair was a nightmare of suspended flame, webs of fire crisscrossing above pools of magma, smaller spiders descending constantly to attack anything that entered her domain. The battle against Beth Talak required the heroes to ascend her webs of flame, climbing into the burning sky to face her directly while their companions dealt with the endless swarms of spiders below. It was a test of coordination and courage, of the ability to fight in 3 dimensions while surrounded by fire. Many heroes fell during this encounter, their bodies consumed by the flames that formed Beth Tiglak's web. Lord Rhyolith was something else entirely, an elemental of such immense size that he created volcanoes simply by walking. His form was a moving mountain, legs of solidity stone supporting a torso that burned with the heart of the earth itself. He did not so much patrol his section of the Firelands as reshape it with every step, his passage leaving trails of new volcanic activity in his wake. Fighting Lord Rhyolith required the heroes to control his movement, directing his massive form toward dormant volcanoes that would damage him upon eruption. It was a strange battle, one where the heroes were not simply attacking their enemy, but steering him, manipulating his movements through careful application of damage to his legs. When he finally fell, his massive form crumbling into rubble and cooling magma, the heroes felt a surge of hope that perhaps they truly could succeed in this impossible mission. Alice Razor soared overhead, a being of flight and fire who burned even brighter than the sky around her. Once, she had been a normal bird, a creature of feathers and flesh. But exposure to Ragnaros' flames had transformed her into something far more dangerous, a phoenix whose very presence could set the air itself ablaze. She rained destruction on any who dared to look up, her screams echoing across the burning landscape. The battle against Alice Razor was unlike any the heroes had experienced. They had to fly, using abilities they had acquired from the Firelands themselves, matching her in her own element. Those who could not take to the air fought from the ground, dodging tornadoes of flame while trying to bring the burning bird within reach. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, a dance with death high above a lake of fire. Shanix was a flame waker who had trained the deadliest hounds in all the Firelands, beasts whose flames burned with particular ferocity. He was not as powerful as some of Ragnaros' other lieutenants, but his bond with his hounds made him dangerous in ways that raw power could not match. Riplim and Rageface, his two most beloved pets, fought with a coordination that spoke of centuries of training. The battle against Shanix required the heroes to manage 3 enemies at once, keeping the hounds separated while dealing damage to their master. If Shanix's pets were killed too quickly, his grief would drive him into a frenzy. If they were allowed to work together, their coordinated attacks would overwhelm the defenders. It was a delicate balance, made more difficult by the cramped terrain and the constant threat of fire. Balrog, the gatekeeper, stood before the entrance to Ragnaros' inner sanctum. He was a warrior of fire whose blade had ended countless lives over millennia of service to the Firelord. His armor was forged from the hardest metals of the Firelands, cooled in magma and tempered in the flames of his own fury. The souls of those he had slain cried out from the crystal that formed his crown. The battle against Balrog was a test of endurance and healing, a fight that seemed to last forever as the heroes slowly ground down his massive health pool. He struck with devastating force, and his blade inflicted wounds that festered with fire, requiring constant attention from the healers. Those who survived the encounter emerged exhausted but stronger, their equipment imbued with the essence of the Firelands themselves. And waiting within that sanctum was Fandral Staghelm, perhaps the most tragic figure in all the Firelands. He had once been the archdruid of the Night Elves, one of the most powerful druids to ever live. His devotion to nature had been absolute, his power unquestioned, but grief over the loss of his son Valston had opened him to corruption, and Ragnaros had found in that grief a weakness to exploit. Fandral had been transformed into a creature of fire and hatred, his connection to nature twisted into a bond with flame. He could shift between forms now as druids had always done, but his shapes were those of fire rather than nature, a scorpion of living flame, a massive cat whose claws burned with the heat of stars. Each form was devastating. Each transition caught the heroes off guard. The battle against Fandral was a battle against corruption itself, against the proof that even the mightiest defenders could fall. Many of the druids who fought him wept as they did so, for they remembered the hero he had been before the flames had claimed him. When he finally fell, when the fire left his body and the shadow of his former self emerged for just a moment before fading away, they gave him the mercy of death, freed from the flames that had consumed his soul. Each of these beings had to be confronted and defeated before the heroes could face Ragnaros himself. The battles were devastating, each one pushing the invaders to their absolute limits. Heroes fell and were resurrected, fell again, and were pulled back from the brink of death by healers whose magical reserves were nearly exhausted. The Firelands seemed determined to consume them, to add their deaths to the countless others who had perished in the realm of flame. But the Avengers of Hejal persevered. Every victory, no matter how costly, brought them closer to their goal. Every lieutenant that fell weakened Ragnaros' defenses, opened new paths deeper into the Firelands. The heroes grew stronger with each battle, their equipment improved by the materials they claimed from their fallen foes, their experience sharpened by the constant life or death struggles. At last, only Ragnaros remained. The final battle against Ragnaros the Firelord took place in the heart of Sulfuron Keep, above a lake of fire even more intense than the one in the molten core. Here, in his true domain, surrounded by the essence of everything that made him what he was, Ragnaros awaited the mortals who had dared to invade his realm. When he rose from the magma, it was clear that this was a different Ragnaros than the one the heroes had faced in Blackrock Mountain. Here in the Firelands, his power was fully unleashed. His form was larger, more intense, burning with a fury that made his previous appearance seem like a candle compared to a bonfire. Sulphurous, his legendary hammer, blazed with flames so bright that looking directly at it caused physical pain. The battle began with Ragnaros calling down Sulphurous' smash, devastating hammer strikes that could instantly kill any hero caught in their path. The floor of the chamber became treacherous, splitting apart to reveal pools of magma that would consume anyone who fell into them. Waves of fire swept across the arena at irregular intervals, forcing the heroes to constantly reposition while still maintaining their assault on the Firelord. As the fight progressed, Ragnaros demonstrated new abilities that had not been seen in the molten core. He summoned Sons of Flame, smaller elementals that had to be killed before they could reach the hammer lodged in the ground at the center of the chamber. If any reached it, the resulting explosion would surely kill everyone present. The heroes had to split their attention between damaging Ragnaros and destroying these adds, a balancing act that required perfect coordination. Between phases of active combat, Ragnaros would submerge into the magma, gathering his strength while his servants attacked the heroes from multiple directions. These intermissions were perhaps even more dangerous than the main phases, as the heroes had to survive without the ability to progress the fight, simply enduring until Ragnaros chose to re-emerge. In the normal version of the encounter, when Ragnaros' health was reduced to 10%, he would retreat, sinking back into the magma and withdrawing from the battle. The heroes would be victorious, having driven off the Firelord, but Ragnaros would survive to potentially threaten the world again. But the most dedicated heroes, those who sought to end the threat permanently, fought on when Ragnaros tried to withdraw. This was where the intervention of Azeroth's greatest defenders made all the difference. Just as Ragnaros attempted to sink back into the magma, just as he tried to escape the defeat that had become inevitable, three figures appeared at the edge of the chamber. Cenarius, the demigod who had been restored to fight against the Firelord's invasion. Malfurion Stormrage, the first druid, perhaps the most powerful mortal spellcaster to ever live. And Hamel Runa Totem, the Tauren archdruid whose knowledge had made this expedition possible. Together, these three channeled their power into the magma surrounding Ragnaros. Nature magic, even in the heart of the Firelands, was not without influence. The molten rock began to solidify around the Firelord, binding him in place, preventing his escape. Ragnaros struggled against the constraint, his fury reaching new heights, but he could not break free. And then, for the first time in the history of Azeroth, Ragnaros revealed his full form. Forced out of the magma that had always concealed his lower body, the Firelord rose to his true height, legs of living flame now visible beneath the torso that had always been his most recognizable feature. He was magnificent in his totality, terrifying in his desperation, and more powerful than he had ever seemed before. Standing at his full height, Ragnaros towered above even the largest of the heroes who faced him. His legs were not flesh or stone, but pure elemental fire, constantly shifting and flickering, yet somehow supporting his massive form. The temperature in the chamber increased dramatically, the air itself seeming to burn as the Firelord channeled every ounce of his considerable power into this final battle. New abilities manifested as Ragnaros drew upon reserves of strength that he had kept hidden throughout all previous encounters. Meteors fell from the sky of flame that served as the Firelands' ceiling, each one massive enough to crush multiple heroes beneath its burning mass. The ground itself turned treacherous, sections of what had seemed solid stone suddenly liquefying into pools of magma that could consume the unwary in moments. The Firelord summoned his blazing heat, a devastating attack that marked certain heroes for destruction. Those affected would find themselves burning from within, their very blood seeming to boil, the heat spreading to anyone who stood too close. The marked individuals had to separate from their companions or risk killing them all, even as Ragnaros continued his relentless assault. Engulfing flames swept across the chamber in predetermined patterns, waves of fire that left no safe ground for those who did not know where to stand. The heroes had to learn these patterns through bitter experience, watching their companions die to reveal which areas were safe and which were instant death. Even with this knowledge, the margin for error was virtually non-existent. The heroes attacked with everything they had. Cenarius created zones of frost that provided shelter from Ragnaros' flames, his nature magic warring against the elemental fire that permeated every inch of the realm. Where his power touched, the temperature dropped enough that mortals could survive, creating islands of relative safety in an ocean of destruction. Malfurion called upon the dream to empower the mortals, enhancing their abilities beyond their normal limits. His blessing flowed through them like cool water through parched earth, strengthening their limbs, sharpening their reflexes, allowing them to move and react faster than should have been possible. The boundaries between mortal and myth blurred as the greatest druid in history poured his power into those who fought at his side. Hamel directed healing energies to those who needed them most, keeping the heroes alive through damage that should have killed them dozens of times over. His connection to the elements, forged through decades of shamanistic practice, allowed him to draw upon even the fire of the Firelands to heal rather than harm. It was a feat of spiritual manipulation that few could have matched, and it made the difference between survival and annihilation. It was a battle for the ages, a confrontation that would be remembered for as long as stories were told on Azeroth. The Firelord, one of the oldest beings in existence, fighting with the desperation of one who knows that defeat means death. The heroes, mortals, whose lives were barely a flicker compared to Ragnaros' eternal existence, standing against a god and refusing to yield. In the end, Ragnaros fell. His form collapsed, the flames that had composed his being flickering and dying. Sulphurus clattered to the ground, its eternal flame extinguished, and Cenarius, looking upon the remains of the being who had threatened everything he loved, spoke the words that confirmed what many had thought impossible. Ragnaros has perished, so that the Firelord was dead, not banished, not imprisoned, not merely defeated, dead. The being who had existed since before the dawn of mortal civilization, who had burned worlds and consumed princes, who had survived the wrath of titans and the enslavement of old gods, was no more. The death of Ragnaros threw the Firelands into chaos. For eons, the realm had been defined by his presence, shaped by his will, ordered according to his desires. Without him, the fire elementals who had served him found themselves without purpose, without direction. The structure that had governed their existence collapsed like a building whose foundations had been suddenly removed. The immediate aftermath of the Firelord's fall was one of confusion and disbelief. Many of the fire elementals who had served Ragnaros for centuries could not comprehend that he was truly gone. They had worshipped him as a god, had believed in his eternal nature with a faith that bordered on religious devotion. To accept his death was to accept that everything they had believed was false. Some elementals entered a state of denial, continuing to perform the rituals and observe the protocols that had defined their service to Ragnaros. They maintained Sulphuraan Keep as though the Firelord might return at any moment, keeping his throne room prepared for his emergence from the magma. These faithful few became increasingly desperate as the years passed and their master did not return. Others reacted with rage, lashing out at anything they could reach. Without Ragnaros' will to direct them, their natural destructive impulses ran wild. Sections of the Firelands burned hotter than ever before as these masterless elementals vented their fury upon their surroundings. Some even attempted to break through the barriers to Azeroth, seeking to continue their master's work of destruction even in his absence. Still others saw opportunity in the chaos. For the first time in millennia, the Firelands lacked a supreme ruler. The position of Firelord was vacant, and any elemental powerful enough to claim it could reshape the realm according to their own desires. Ambition stirred in the hearts of beings who had spent eons suppressing such impulses in the presence of Ragnaros' overwhelming power. A power struggle immediately erupted among the remaining elementals. Two factions emerged, each led by a being who believed themselves worthy of claiming the title of Firelord. Smolderun, a fire elemental of considerable power who had served as one of Ragnaros' more trusted lieutenants, rallied those who favored a more measured approach to leadership. He argued that the endless wars against Azeroth had only brought defeat and destruction, that the Firelands would be better served by consolidating their power rather than wasting it on futile invasions. Pyroth, equally powerful but more aggressive, gathered those who wished to continue Ragnaros' mission of conquest and destruction. He viewed Smolderaan's caution as weakness, arguing that the mortals who had killed their master would eventually return to finish what they had started. Better to strike first, Pyroth argued, to overwhelm Azeroth before its defenders could recover from their victory. For years, the civil war raged within the Firelands. The conflict was devastating, consuming resources and destroying countless lesser elementals. Lakes of magma that had remained stable for millennia were churned into chaos by the fighting. Volcanic spires that had stood since Ragnaros' imprisonment were toppled by the warring factions. The realm itself seemed to be tearing itself apart. Neither side was able to gain a decisive advantage, and the stalemate seemed likely to continue indefinitely. Smolderaan's forces were more numerous, but Pyroth's followers were more fanatical, willing to sacrifice themselves in attacks that caused tremendous damage before they were destroyed. For every victory one side achieved, the other would respond with an equally devastating counterattack. The resolution came from an unexpected source, the Earthen Ring, an organization of shamans dedicated to maintaining the balance between the elements. During the third invasion of the Burning Legion, when demons once again threatened to consume Azeroth, the Earthen Ring recognized that the chaos in the Firelands was a danger to everyone. An unstable elemental plane could have consequences far beyond the realm of fire itself. A shaman known as the Farseer ventured into the Firelands to assess the situation. What they found was a realm torn apart by conflict, elementals battling elementals, while the dimension itself threatened to collapse into pure chaos. Something had to be done, and quickly. The Farseer chose to support Smolderaan's claim to the title of Firelord. Of the two candidates, Smolderaan seemed more willing to work with mortals, more interested in stability than conquest. The Earthen Ring retrieved Emberscar, Brand of Damnation, a powerful weapon that would symbolize Smolderaan's authority, and they aided him in defeating Pyroth once and for all. With Pyroth destroyed and the opposition crushed, Smolderaan became the new Firelord. He accepted the Earthen Ring's plea for cooperation, agreeing to maintain peace between the Firelands and Azeroth in exchange for their help in securing his throne. For a time, it seemed as though the age of elemental invasions might truly be over, but Smolderaan's reign would prove to be troubled. Shortly after becoming Firelord, he disappeared from the Firelands entirely. The elementals who had supported his rise to power found themselves abandoned, their new leader vanishing without explanation or warning. The throne of Sulfuron Keep sat empty once more, and whispers spread through the realm of betrayal, of ambition gone wrong, of schemes that had backfired in ways no one could have predicted. During Smolderaan's absence, the Firelands entered a period of uncertainty. Without a Firelord to rule them, the fire elementals fell into their natural hierarchies, with powerful individuals claiming territory and lesser elementals pledging allegiance to whatever leader seemed strongest. It was a return to the chaos that had followed Ragnaros' death, though on a smaller scale. The systems that Smolderaan had put in place held, but only barely, and there were many who wondered if the realm would ever know true stability again. When Smolderaan finally returned years later, He had changed. The elemental who had once seemed willing to cooperate with mortals, who had accepted the earthen ring's assistance in claiming his throne, now spoke of conquest and domination. He had allied himself with forces that threatened everything the earthen ring had worked to protect, forces that made even Ragnaros's ambitions seem modest by comparison. Fyrakk, one of the primal incarnates, had emerged as a new threat to Azeroth during the events surrounding the Dragon Isles. These ancient proto-dragons were beings from before the time of the Titans' ordering, creatures of pure elemental power who had been imprisoned long ago for their refusal to accept the changes that the Pantheon brought to Azeroth. Fyrakk was the incarnate of fire, a being whose flames burned with an intensity that exceeded even the greatest fire elementals. The primal incarnate sought to burn the world in a conflagration that would dwarf anything even Ragnaros had attempted. Where the Firelord had wanted to conquer Azeroth, to rule over its ashes as supreme lord of all that remained, Fyrakk wanted only destruction. He saw the ordered world that the Titans had created as an abomination, a corruption of the primal chaos that had existed before their arrival. His goal was not dominion, but annihilation, the complete erasure of everything the Titans had built. And Smolderun, whether through corruption or calculated choice, had joined him. Perhaps the new Firelord had been seduced by Fyrakk's power, impressed by the incarnate's flames in a way that no mortal could have managed. Perhaps he had been promised rewards beyond anything the Firelands could offer. Or perhaps, deep down, Smolderun had always harbored the same desire for destruction that had defined Ragnaros, and Fyrakk had simply given him the opportunity to act on it. Together, Smolderun and Fyrakk launched an assault on Amerdrassil, the new world tree that had grown in the Emerald Dream. This tree was the replacement for Teldrassil, which had been burned during the Fourth War in one of the greatest atrocities Azeroth had ever witnessed. The Night Elves had nurtured Amerdrassil with hope and sorrow, pouring their grief into something beautiful and new. For Fyrakk to target, it was not just strategic, but personal, a deliberate echo of past destruction designed to break the spirits of those who would oppose him. The attack was devastating, threatening to succeed where Ragnaros had failed at Mount Hyjal. Fire elementals poured through the Emerald Dream, their flames consuming the verdant landscapes that had existed since the dawn of creation. The dream, which had always been a place of growth and renewal, became a battlefield where nature itself was fighting for survival. It seemed as though the cycle of elemental aggression would never end, as though fire would always seek to consume what nature tried to create. The defenders of Azeroth had defeated Ragnaros, had helped establish Smolderun as a more reasonable successor, had done everything they could to ensure that the age of elemental invasions was over. And yet here they were again, facing flames that threatened to consume everything they had fought to protect. But the heroes of Azeroth rose to defend the World Tree once again. They confronted Smolderun in battle, and though the Firelord fought with power inherited from his position, he found himself outmatched. The mortals who faced him had grown strong through countless battles, their equipment forged in the fires of 100 conflicts, their skills honed by years of experience against threats that should have been impossible to overcome. As defeat became inevitable, Smolderun called upon Fyrakk for aid. He had served the incarnate faithfully, had brought the power of the Firelands to bear in support of the assault on Amardrassil. Surely his ally would not abandon him in his moment of need. Fyrak's response was not what Smolderon had expected. The primal incarnate, it turned out, had been using the Firelord all along. He had no interest in sharing power, no intention of honoring whatever alliance they had forged. Smolderon had been nothing more than a tool, a means of bringing elemental fire to the battle without Fyrak having to expend his own power. Now that the tool had outlived its usefulness, it could be discarded. More than discarded, in fact. Fyrak saw in Smolderon's defeat an opportunity to grow even stronger. Instead of coming to the Firelord's aid, the Incarnate swooped down to claim his prize. Using his weapon, Firaloth the Dreamrender, Fyrak absorbed the essence of the dying Firelord. The process was agonizing, Smolderon's form being torn apart and consumed by the very ally he had trusted. His last words were of outrage and betrayal, a curse against the one who had deceived him. He had thought himself Fyrak's partner, perhaps even his equal, and now he understood the truth. He had been nothing but fuel for the Incarnate's flames. Then his flames went out, and the second Firelord to die in mortal memory was no more. What this means for the future of the Firelands remains uncertain. Unlike Ragnaros, who was slain in his own domain, Smolderon died in the Emerald Dream. The rules that govern elemental existence suggest that an elemental destroyed outside their home plane might eventually reform within it, their essence drawn back to the source of their power over time. But Fyrak's absorption of Smolderon's essence complicates this possibility. If the Incarnate consumed Smolderon entirely, integrated his power into his own being, then the Firelord might truly be gone forever. The question may never be answered, and the Firelands may never see another Firelord rise to claim the empty throne of Sulfuron Keep. The legacy of Ragnaros extends far beyond his own actions. The Firelord's influence has shaped Azeroth in ways that persist long after his death. The volcanic region around Blackrock Mountain remains a scar on the landscape, a permanent reminder of the day when a desperate dwarf summoned forces beyond his control. The burning steppes and the searing gorge still glow with unnatural heat, their soil infused with elemental fire that refuses to dissipate even centuries after the initial summoning. Trees do not grow in these regions. Water evaporates before it can collect into streams. The very land itself seems to reject life, a testament to the corrupting influence of the Firelord's presence. The Dark Iron Clan, though now free from Ragnaros's direct control and allied with the Alliance under Moira Tharasan's leadership, still bears the marks of generations spent in the Firelord's service. Their skin retains the gray pallor that developed from centuries of living in volcanic depths. Their eyes still glow with an inner fire, a permanent reminder of the elemental energies that suffused their homeland. Some among them still feel the pull of flame, an echo of the worship that their ancestors were forced to practice. The transformation of the Dark Iron Clan from enslaved worshippers to proud members of the Alliance is itself one of the most remarkable stories to emerge from Ragnaros's legacy. When the Firelord was first banished back to the Firelands after his defeat in the Molten Core, the Dark Irons found themselves in a strange position. Their master was gone, but the conditioning that had shaped their culture for generations remained. Many continued to worship the Firelord, even in his absence. maintaining the rituals and practices that had defined Dark Iron society for centuries. It was Moira Thorison, daughter of King Magni Bronzebeard and widow of the former Dark Iron Emperor, who began the slow process of reclaiming her people. She had come to the Dark Iron clan under controversial circumstances, initially a political hostage who had fallen in love with her captor. But after her husband's death, she became the leader of the entire clan, and she was determined to guide them toward a better future. Under Moira's leadership, the Dark Iron clan began to question the traditions that had defined them for so long. They still valued their craftsmanship, still took pride in their ability to work metal at temperatures that would kill other smiths. But they no longer saw fire as a god to be worshipped. Instead, they viewed it as a tool to be mastered, a resource to be harnessed rather than surrendered to. This shift in perspective, more than any military victory or political alliance, represented the true end of Ragnaros' influence over the dwarven people. The forges of Shadowforge City, the dark iron capital deep beneath Blackrock Mountain, still burn with supernatural intensity. The techniques developed during generations of servitude to the Firelord have not been forgotten. Dark iron craftsmen remain among the most skilled metalworkers in all of Azeroth, their weapons and armor prized for their unique properties. The fire that once enslaved them has become the source of their greatest strength, a fitting irony that speaks to the resilience of the dwarven spirit. The battles against Ragnaros in both the Molten Core and the Firelands are remembered as some of the most significant conflicts in Azeroth's recent history. The heroes who fought in those encounters are legends, their names spoken with reverence by those who followed in their footsteps. Songs are sung about the first groups to venture into the Molten Core, ballads of courage and sacrifice that capture the spirit of those desperate early expeditions. Taverns across Azeroth display artifacts recovered from those battles, weapons and armor that bear the marks of elemental fire. The tactics they developed, the strategies they pioneered, became templates for confronting elemental threats of all kinds. The understanding that fire elementals were vulnerable to frost magic, the recognition that their lieutenants had to be dealt with systematically, the importance of coordination and communication in environments of extreme heat, all of these lessons were preserved and passed down to future generations of adventurers. When new elemental threats emerged, the veterans of the Ragnaros campaigns were consulted, their experience proving invaluable time and again. Ragnaros himself remains a symbol, an icon of the raw, destructive power that elementals represent. His words continue to echo through time, particularly his famous declaration that has become synonymous with overwhelming force. Warriors who wield fire magic sometimes invoke his name, knowingly or not, when they call upon the flames. The relationship between mortals and elementals was forever changed by the conflicts with Ragnaros. Before his invasions, many on Azeroth viewed fire elementals as merely dangerous wildlife, threats to be avoided, but not particularly significant in the grand scheme of things. Ragnaros demonstrated that elementals could be organized, purposeful, and capable of threatening civilizations. This understanding informed how Azeroth's defenders approached subsequent elemental threats. The Firelord's alliance with the old gods during the Cataclysm also revealed something important about the nature of these beings. Despite his pride, despite his hatred for those who had enslaved him in the ancient past. Ragnaros was willing to serve the old gods again if it meant achieving his goals. This pragmatism, or perhaps this weakness, suggested that even the most powerful elementals could be manipulated by those who offered them what they truly wanted. Perhaps most significantly, Ragnaros's death proved that the elemental lords were not truly immortal. For millennia, it had been assumed that beings of such fundamental nature could not be permanently destroyed. They could be banished, imprisoned, weakened, but never truly killed. Ragnaros's end in the Firelands shattered that assumption, opening the possibility that other seemingly eternal threats might also be ended if confronted in the right way, in the right place. The Firelands themselves continue to exist, though they are now ruled by different powers than in Ragnaros's time. The realm remains one of the most dangerous locations in all the planes of existence, a dimension of eternal fire where mortal life can only survive through the most powerful magical protections. The temperatures within the Firelands exceed anything found naturally on Azeroth, hot enough to vaporize steel and ignite stone. The very air burns in ways that mortal lungs cannot survive, and the light is so intense that unprotected eyes would be blinded in moments. Yet adventurers still venture there occasionally, seeking treasures left behind from the age of Ragnaros, or pursuing goals of their own. The rewards of braving the Firelands are substantial, for the realm contains materials and artifacts that cannot be found anywhere else in all the worlds. Flame-touched ore that never cools, jewels that glow with inner fire, metals tempered in temperatures that no forge on Azeroth could match. These treasures draw the bold and the foolish alike, though many who enter the Firelands never return. The creatures that remained after Ragnaros's fall have adapted to the absence of their master. Fire elementals continue their eternal existence, some forming new hierarchies, others wandering the burning landscapes in solitary contemplation. The Flamewakers who once served the Firelord have splintered into factions, some seeking to restore the old order, others embracing the chaos of the leaderless realm. The core hounds and flame spiders and other beasts of fire still hunt through the magma rivers and volcanic plains, their predatory instincts unchanged despite the loss of the being who once commanded them. Sulphurus, Hand of Ragnaros, the legendary hammer that the Firelord wielded in battle, has passed into new hands. The story of how this weapon came to be on Azeroth is itself a testament to the determination of those who fought against Ragnaros. When the Firelord was first defeated in the molten core, his hammer fell into the magma from which he had risen. Most believed it lost forever, submerged in the depths of the volcanic lake, but some refused to give up on claiming such a prize. Skilled craftsmen and powerful adventurers worked together to create a new version of the legendary weapon, using the Eye of Sulphurus, a component that had dropped from Ragnaros himself, combined with materials gathered from the mightiest creatures of the molten core. The result was Sulphurus, as Hand of Ragnaros, a hammer that channeled the power of the Firelord himself. The weapon became a symbol of triumph over the elemental lord, proof that mortals could challenge beings of godlike power and emerge victorious. Warriors who wielded it found their strikes enhanced by elemental fire, their enemies bursting into flames upon contact. The hammer's weight, which should have been impossible for mortals to lift, felt somehow manageable in the hands of those who had proven themselves worthy through combat. Crafted in the depths of the Firelands, imbued with power beyond mortal understanding, the weapon remains one of the most sought-after artifacts on Azeroth. Those who wield it feel echoes of the Fire Lord's power, a connection to the elemental forces that once made Ragnaros the terror of two worlds. The hammer burns with eternal flame, a fire that can never be extinguished, and its strikes carry the weight of millennia of accumulated elemental fury. Some say that the weapon contains a fragment of Ragnaros's consciousness, a splinter of awareness that survived the Fire Lord's destruction. Those who carry sulphurus sometimes report hearing whispers in moments of battle, urging them toward greater violence, promising power beyond imagining. Whether these are true communications from a fallen god or simply the imagination of warriors pushed to their limits remains unknown, but the weapon's power is undeniable, a reminder that even in death, Ragnaros's influence persists. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the realm of the Firelands as it exists now, in the aftermath of all that has happened. Picture vast lakes of magma stretching to horizons that burn with the same intensity as the ground, rivers of fire flowing through channels carved by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The sky above is not a sky at all, but simply more fire, flames that dance and flicker in patterns that have remained unchanged for countless millennia. Feel the heat of this place, not as burning pain, but as enveloping warmth, the kind of deep warmth that reaches into your very bones and relaxes muscles you did not even know were tense. In this realm of eternal fire, there is no cold, no chill, no shivering. There is only the constant, comforting presence of heat, surrounding you like a blanket made of embers. The light here is not harsh, but diffuse, filtering through layers of flame and smoke to create a perpetual golden glow. There are no shadows in the Firelands, for light comes from every direction at once. Every surface radiates its own illumination. Every flame provides its own soft brightness. It is a light that does not demand attention, that does not strain the eyes, but simply exists as a constant, gentle presence. Listen to the sounds of this realm. The crackle of flames is a rhythm as old as creation, a steady heartbeat of combustion that has played without pause since the dawn of time. The bubbling of magma provides a bass note beneath the crackling, a deep and resonant sound that vibrates through the air itself. Occasionally, a distant eruption adds a deeper rumble to the symphony, a reminder of the raw power that shapes this dimension. In the distance rises Sulfuron Keep, the fortress that Ragnaros built as his throne. Its walls are dark stone that has absorbed so much heat it glows with a dull red light, pulsing almost imperceptibly with the rhythm of the realm itself. Its towers pierce the burning sky, monuments to a being who believed himself eternal. The keep stands empty now, its master fallen, its purpose ended. But it remains a testament to what once was, a reminder that even the greatest powers eventually fade. The architecture of the keep is both beautiful and terrible, obsidian spires reaching toward the flames above, bridges of hardened magma connecting towers that seem to defy the laws of physics. Ragnaros built this place to last forever, and in a sense it will. Long after the memory of the Firelord has faded from mortal minds, Sulfuron Keep will still stand, a silent sentinel in a realm of eternal fire. Somewhere in this realm, fire elementals continue their existence, They are creatures of pure flame, beings for whom concepts like birth and death have different meanings than they do for mortals. They remember Ragnaros in their way. They remember his power and his fury, his ambition and his fall. Whether they mourn him or celebrate his end depends on the individual, but none forget. His legend lives on in the dancing of their flames, in the patterns of their movements, in the way they speak of the time before the mortals came. The boundaries between the Firelands and Azeroth remain, though they are not as strong as they once were. The cataclysm weakened barriers throughout the elemental plane, and those weaknesses have never been fully repaired. Occasionally, fire elementals slip through to the mortal world, drawn by heat or summoned by magic. They are usually dealt with quickly, but they serve as reminders that the threat of fire is never truly gone. And perhaps, in the deepest reaches of the Firelands, in places where even the most powerful elementals fear to venture, something of Ragnaros remains. Not his consciousness, not his will, but the pure essence of what he represented. Fire itself is eternal, after all. It cannot be destroyed, only transformed. The flames that composed Ragnaros's being did not cease to exist when he fell. They simply scattered, dissipated, merged with the endless conflagration of his realm. Some say that if one listens carefully in the heart of the Firelands, one can still hear echoes of the Firelord's voice, words spoken over countless millennia, commands given and threats made, declarations of power that still resonate through the dimension he ruled. These are probably just stories, legends created by those who cannot quite believe that something so ancient and powerful could truly be gone. But stories have power of their own, as any who have studied the history of Azeroth knows. The story of Ragnaros the Firelord will be told for as long as there are beings capable of telling it. The tale of the elemental who ruled fire since before time had meaning, who was enslaved and banished and freed and defeated and ultimately destroyed. It is a story of power and hubris, of patience and rage, of a being who burned too bright and too hot, who sought to consume the world and was instead consumed himself. As you listen to these final words, let your body relax completely. Feel the tension leaving your shoulders, your arms, your hands. Let your jaw unclench and your brow smooth. The fire that burned so brightly in this tale is fading now, and with it, any stress or worry that you carried into this moment. Imagine a single flame before you, a candle perhaps, or a small fire in a hearth. Watch it dance and flicker, its movements hypnotic and soothing. The flame does not demand anything from you. It does not require action or thought. It simply burns peacefully, casting its gentle light into the darkness around it. The warmth from this flame reaches you, a comfortable heat that settles over your skin like a blanket. It is not the consuming fire of Ragnaros, not the elemental fury that sought to devour worlds. This is fire tamed, fire contained, fire serving the purpose for which it was always meant, to warm, to comfort, to illuminate the darkness without overwhelming it. Rest now as the flames of this tale fade to embers. Let the warmth of your own fire, wherever you may be, remind you of the elemental force that Ragnaros embodied. Fire is necessary for life, for warmth, for light. It cooks our food and forges our tools. But it is also destruction incarnate, capable of ending everything it touches, if not kept in check. The balance between creation and destruction, between the life-giving warmth and the all-consuming inferno, is what the Titans sought when they banished the elemental lords. It is what the defenders of Azeroth fought to preserve when they confronted Ragnaros. And it is what you preserve every time you tend a flame, keeping it burning bright enough to serve its purpose, but controlled enough not to spread beyond its bounds. Think now of all the fires that have warmed you throughout your life. Campfires on cold nights, their crackling a music that speaks of safety and companionship. Hearth fires in homes both remembered and forgotten, their light casting familiar shadows on beloved walls. Candles lit for celebration or contemplation, their flames steady points of brightness in a world that sometimes seems too dark. These are the fires that matter, not the consuming fury of an elemental lord, but the gentle flames that have been part of human existence since our earliest ancestors first learned to harness this most fundamental of forces. Fire was our first technology, the discovery that lifted us from the darkness and the cold, and it remains with us still, even in a world of electricity and convenience. The embers of this story glow softly now, their heat fading as the tale comes to its end. But embers can be stirred to life again, rekindled into flame when the need arises. And so it is with stories. They never truly end, they simply wait for the next time they are told, the next listener who comes seeking their warmth. If you enjoyed this tale of the Firelord and his fall, please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the world of Azeroth. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Ragnaros, on the battles fought against him, on what his death means for the future of elemental conflict on Azeroth. Share which moments from his story resonated most with you, whether it was his ancient origins, his catastrophic summoning, or his final defeat in the heart of his own domain. Good night, dear listener. Rest well now, and may your dreams be free of flame and fury. May you find only warmth in your sleep, the gentle kind that comforts rather than consumes. May the darkness around you feel like a blanket rather than a void, filled with the soft glow of remembered fires and the promise of warmth to come. The story is complete. The Firelord's tale has been told from beginning to end, from his emergence in the primordial chaos to his final defeat in the heart of his own realm. Let this tale carry you now into sleep, its words fading into the comfortable darkness behind your closed eyes. Breathe deeply. Feel the rise and fall of your chest, steady as the flames that have burned throughout this narrative. Each breath takes you deeper into relaxation, further from the waking world, and closer to the realm of dreams. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. No battles to fight, no fires to quench, no ancient elementals to confront. And may you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever fires life might bring, knowing that even the mightiest flames can be overcome by those with the courage to confront them. Sleep now, dear listener. Rest deeply and well tonight. The embers are fading into the welcoming darkness. The Firelord is no more, and peaceful sleep awaits you.